Thank you all for standing by. All lines have been placed in a listen-only mode throughout the duration of today's conference. Today's conference is being recorded. If you do have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the call over to Lori Bird, National Renewable Energy Lab. Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much for joining us for today's webinar on regulatory considerations associated with the expanded adoption of distributed solar. Before we get started, a couple of logistical things. I just want to say that all the participants are in listen-only mode. We will be taking questions, but we would like you to type in your questions. So you use the Q&A panel during the webinar. Anytime you can type in your question, and we'll respond to those at the end of the session. And as you just heard from the operator, the webinar is being recorded. After the webinar, we will make it available on the web, and we can provide that information to you. So today we're going to have two speakers, one from the National Renewable Energy Lab, which is a Department of Energy lab based in Golden, Colorado. That's Joyce McLaren. And we're also going to have Carl Linvill with the Regulatory Assistance Project. And they're going to be speaking, we're going to divide the section, the webinar into a couple of groups. Let me introduce them first. Joyce McLaren has been a senior energy analyst with NREL for the past 5 years. She conducts analysis on renewable energy markets, policy, and program design at the local, state, and national levels, and has completed a number of international policy comparisons. Her most recent work is focused on business models and programs for distributed solar, investor decision-making, and on assisting municipal utilities in renewable energy program design. Before coming to NREL, Joyce worked at the California Energy Commission in the R&D and Renewables Office, and she obtained her doctorate in Science and Technology Policy from the University of Sussex in England. Carl Linvill is a principal with the Regulatory Assistance Project and is based in Davis, California. He served as Economic and Energy Advisor to Nevada Governor Kenny Gwinn as a Public Utility Commissioner and an academic and consulting economist before and after living in Nevada. Dr. Linvill is active with the RAP U.S. program, working on a variety of resource planning issues with a recent focus on distributed generation and demand response planning and valuation, renewable resource integration, and regional transmission planning. Dr. Linvill received his BA in Math and Econ from the University of California at Davis and a PhD in economics from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So we're going to hear first from Joyce McLaren of NREL, who's going to provide a bit of a background on these issues and then talk about business models for distributed solar. And then we're going to turn it over to Carl, who's going to talk about the costs and benefits and valuing distributed solar on the system and some rate structure issues. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joyce. And again, I'm just going to advise you we're going to take the questions at the end of the webinar, so just type those in as you have them. Okay, thanks very much. Go ahead, Joyce.
Thanks, Lori. So first I'd like to give a little bit of background about why distributed solar has received so much attention of late and distinguish between the various topics that are being discussed across the states. Next slide. The price of solar has dropped rapidly in recent years, as you probably know, and we've seen the emergence of new business models for distributed solar development, such as the third-party lease that you may be familiar with. And with this increased development, the utilities have become concerned that as more customers are generating their own electricity, the utility will have less revenue. And this is because under the current rate structures, the utilities earn revenue from the sale of kilowatt hours. The costs of maintaining the grid are also paid for through these kilowatt hour sales. And so if not enough customers, or if a lot of customers are generating their own power and not paying for the cost of maintaining the grid, then the costs of that grid maintenance are shifted to the non-solar customers. So there's a concern about ensuring that there's sufficient utility revenues to maintain the reliability of the grid for all customers, as well as a concern about equity between solar and non-solar customers. And as the discussion about these issues has increased, the solar industry has become concerned themselves that policies and rate changes that may be put into place to try to correct for these concerns will undervalue the solar generation that's being put onto the grid and hinder the continued growth of the solar market. So there's an increasing number of states that are having active discussions related to these issues. And as you'll see, there's actually a wide variety of topics that the states are discussing. So I thought I'd give a little detail about these topics because we often are concentrating on what's going on in our own state, and we don't really realize that right next door there's another very interesting and relevant conversation going on. So this slide shows the various issues that the states are discussing. There's increasing interest in the value of solar tariff, which is a rate design that's based on a valuation of the costs and benefits of solar to the system and to society. There's discussions about whether virtual net metering and meter aggregation should be allowed, both of which open the door for projects where customers can invest in solar projects that aren't located on their own roofs. And there's discussions about how large the cost shift between solar and non-solar customers actually is, and what mechanisms should be put into place to address any equity issue. Some states are considering the option of increasing the fixed charges on electricity bills, and then there's other rate options that can also address those concerns, and Carl will go into those in more detail a little bit later. So as you see, I'm not going to go through all of these topics, but there are a lot of questions being asked across the states. And while we're not going to be able to cover everything in this webinar, our hope is that we'll be able to provide a better understanding of what some of these questions and issues are all about. So next I'll go over some of the business models that are being used to develop distributed solar projects today, and then look at some of the options for models where the utility is playing a bigger role, and some models that might alleviate some of the concerns about utility loss. So as you probably know, the distributed solar really began with the customer-owned model, where everyone that had solar panels on their home were actually the owners of those panels. And it meant that they had to have the capital available to invest in those systems. More recently, the solar market has opened up to a much wider group of customers with the emergence of the third-party leasing model. And that's where the solar developer installs and owns the system on a rooftop and leases the system to the building owner or has a PPA to sell the generation to them. And this means that the homeowner doesn't have to provide upfront capital in most cases, or very much less upfront capital to purchase the system. And even more recently, the market has opened up to customers who don't have enough solar resource for a system on their roof or who don't have a roof of their own. And that's with the community solar gardens, where individuals can invest in a portion of a larger solar system and get the same benefits as someone with a system on their roof. And I'll go into more detail about that model in just a moment. Then there's other emerging business models that include ones where the utility is the owner of distributed solar systems, or they can act as an energy manager of many different distributed systems on their grid. And then there can be partnerships between utilities and third-party solar providers. And also in the future, maybe utilities would take the opportunity to provide more comprehensive energy services related to distributed generation. So all of these models are discussed in our report that this presentation is based on. So I would encourage you to look that up if you're wanting more detail about any of the various models after the webinar. So the first model I'll go into a little more detail about is the community solar model, otherwise known as solar gardens. And this model is gaining a lot of momentum right now, but there's still a lot of people who really haven't heard of it or don't really know what it is. And that's why we thought we would highlight it in a bit more detail. So as I said before, the community solar model is, or solar gardens as it's often called, are larger solar systems that many customers are investing in and can gain a portion of the benefits from. And that those benefits would be in proportion to their investment. So it's like buying a share. And there's many different options for how the projects or the programs are organized. They can be initiated by a utility or a community group or city. There's a lot of different options there. And many of the early solar gardens were actually begun by municipal utilities. And one characteristic that's particularly nice about solar gardens is that they can be located anywhere, which means that you can take advantage of brownfields, of roofs on public buildings, and all kinds of locations. It's not limited to just the roof that you happen to have above you. And in developing the larger solar array, you're able to take advantage of economies of scale that aren't possible for individual systems. So here's a list of some of the benefits of solar gardens to different players. A wider variety of customers can participate in solar gardens than individual solar systems on rooftops, and they can benefit from the same rate stability and bill savings just as if they had the solar on their roof. The developer is providing a service that customers are increasingly wanting, which is to be involved in solar, and they can advertise the regional economic development benefits of the project. If it's a utility-led project, the utility can save money on providing solar incentives potentially, and they can potentially locate the system on a place on the grid that's supporting the grid in ways that aren't possible for individual systems on people's houses. This slide simply shows a list of the solar gardens, where they're located, and gives some examples of utility-led and community-led projects around the country. And you can go to the website that's listed here to get more information on each of the projects, or upload a project into the database if you know of one that's not on the map. So that's a good resource. And if you're interested in starting a community solar project, there's a lot of design considerations. You have to decide on the ownership structure, the details of the customer subscriptions, how the renewable energy credits will be treated, how to maximize incentives amongst players, and how to work out the billing and the pricing details. And it's this last element that is one that several municipal utilities have approached NREL for assistance with. So we've been developing a model here to help understand the economics behind a community solar project and how to determine the right price for each customer share in the project. And if you're interested in that, you can certainly contact me for more information on that model. And those details are really more from the developer's perspective. But if you're a regulator, what questions do you need to be asking to support or learn about community solar projects in your area? This is a list of some of the questions that may need to be addressed. There can be securities issues unless you design the program carefully not to trigger security issues. There's the question of net metering. Does your state have net metering? Does the policy limit the benefits to a single customer? Does it require that solar systems be on customers' property? That can be a barrier to community solar projects. And some states are also starting to require that utilities offer community solar projects, so that's something that some regulators are thinking about. So just to finish off the community solar model, here's a couple of resources that could be helpful, and I'm sure there's other good ones out there. This is just a short list. So next I'll highlight a few other business models, most of which we only have one or two examples of to date, but they may become interesting options to both utilities and regulators as time goes on. And there's a few examples of utilities that are owning distributed solar themselves. And if allowed by regulators, these distributed systems can be part of the regular supply-side resource in the planning process. And then you can imagine moving to a future with increasing amounts of distributed generation on the grid. And this idea can expand into a model where the utility may continue to own DG systems or not, but acts mainly as a manager of the many distributed resources on their system. and they balance the load using demand-side management and smart grid technologies, and can influence the placement of distributed generation to take advantage of the benefits that it can provide to their distribution system. And in order to encourage the use of that type of business model, regulators can do things like allow utilities to recover the cost of investments in distributed generation and in smart grid technologies. They can also encourage the utilities to put distributed generation into resource plans, integrated resource plans. And there can, of course, be benefits to the utility if the regulatory environment is designed to help them take advantage of the various opportunities. There's a couple of examples of these business models in action today. Duke Energy is investing in distributed solar on offices and schools and different manufacturing facilities. And they've cited a desire simply to learn about the opportunities that DG is providing. And that's an interesting model that I think will be expanding. There's also a pilot project being conducted by APS where they've installed many distributed systems on a feeder in Flagstaff to simulate a future with very high penetrations of DG. And the utility is both owning and managing the systems and is using the pilot to test out smart grid technologies and to learn how to maximize the performance of the many DG systems on the grid. And then the last two models that I'll mention briefly are some examples where a utility subsidiary would actually be required. And the first is the partnership between utilities and third-party solar developers. And this is where utilities would invest in the growing market for solar leases. And the utility really is in a pretty good place to participate in this because they can provide capital for the project, and they're in an ideal place to help reduce the cost of obtaining new solar customers since they already have both connection to the customers and the name recognition. And if the utility is allowed to include that investment in their resource plan or in their rate base, then they can potentially earn revenues from those investments and partner with these very active third-party partners. And the last model is one in which the utility expands their role to provide a more comprehensive menu of services and acts as really a one-stop shop where customers can go to the utility for energy efficiency contracting, distributed generation contracting, demand-side management services, and financing for energy projects. So rather than earning revenue mostly on kilowatt-hour sales, the utility would be really compensated for those energy services as a consultant would be through contracts with vendors and fees for services with customers. So I'll end with just a few additional questions that regulators may want to think about when they're considering these new business models. First, which business model is best suited for the market in their state? Which ones are going to ensure that there'll be sufficient revenue to maintain a reliable system, a reliable grid, and to ensure equity across the ratepayers? And which models or what changes would be needed to create a regulatory system that would facilitate any of these new business models to form? And really the answer to these questions may change over time with changing markets, so really our work would never be done there. So with that, I'll pass it on to Carl to talk about the efforts to value distributed solar and some of the rate structure considerations.
Actually, let's do a quick question, just a clarifying question before we move on. Someone asked, can you talk more about the securities issues and how can they be triggered or avoided? So before you go, let's just handle that one.
Okay, good question. I'm actually not a lawyer, and so I don't want to say a lot of detail about it, but from my understanding, in some places, there is very specific language about the sale of shares. So you have to be careful when you're designing your community solar project that you don't trigger a securities issue by creating the program in a way that it looks like you are selling shares. There's definitely ways to get around that problem. It's not a showstopper by any means. It's just something that someone needs to be aware of when they're designing a program and needs to do a bit of consultation with somebody familiar with the language and securities, the securities language, in order not to trigger that.
Okay, Carl, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Good.
Yep. Okay. The second part of the presentation, another part of the regulatory considerations report is a discussion of evaluation of distributed resources. Before embarking on any particular implementation of a net metering or DG program, utility commissions typically consider, what is the value of these resources, and what might fair compensation look like for these resources. The material that I'm going to present here, most of it is in the regulatory considerations report. RAP also at the same time was producing another report which contains some of this information. That report's called Designing Distributed Generation Tariffs Well. Here we go. Okay, there's a long tradition of thinking about value, and that value depends on one's perspective. So whenever the regulators stand to think about whether the costs, benefits associated with distributed generation or really any program, there are different perspectives on what costs and benefits are. There's the perspective of the customer that would be adopting, in this case, a PV system. There's the perspective of those customers who would not be adopters. There's the perspective of the utility as a operator of a system. And then there's the perspective of society. Analysts have used different cost and benefit components, even when evaluating each of these perspectives. And so it's important to get some clarity both on what perspective are we seeking to evaluate costs and benefits from, and secondly, what costs and benefits are we including. One kind of simple way of looking at these 5 different valuation perspectives on some tests that were developed initially to evaluate energy efficiency programs and what energy efficiency programs a utility commission might improve would be, first of all, from the customer's perspective, and from that customer that is adopting PV, their question is, how will my costs and benefits change? Other customers that aren't adopters, are asking the question, well, will utility rates change for me? And what do the benefits and costs look like for me, for other people being adopters? And from a utility perspective, how will utility costs change? From a total resource cost perspective, what is the total sum of the utility costs and the PV system customer costs? How does that change on a net basis, net of benefits? And from societal perspective, how do the costs and benefits change relative to society from having this program implemented? In the energy efficiency program space, the most common test that's used by states is the total resource cost test. You can see a breakdown here of how often different tests are used. And you can see that states will use multiple tests because they tell them something different about the program. But typically a state will also select a primary test, one that is kind of a make or break, is this program beneficial or not? And the test most commonly used for that is the total resource cost test. So as we move to the world of DG and we start thinking about, well, how do we apply this information to the context of DG? And we think about what kind of benefits and costs should we be taking into account in trying to come to some sort of net value characterization of a DG program, a net metering program, what have you. The benefits, and as noted here, the terminology of benefits and costs does vary from one study to the next, but those things which may be included by benefits in some cases for some tests include the energy produced, the savings in system line losses, the deferment of generation capacity, the effects on transmission and distribution capacity of having this DG adopted, any benefits from fuel diversity, from a fuel price hedge, any risk, potential risk benefits, any environmental benefits, and grid security and reliability are sometimes included in benefit test as well, or benefit calculation as well. With respect to costs or the direct costs of the system, there's the administrative costs, administrating the program. There's interconnection costs, having these systems interconnected to the system. Costs associated with modifying the system to ensure reliability in the presence of the system, or, just summarized by its integration costs here, or any risk or opportunity costs otherwise entering in. So when people attempt to come up with a valuation of a solar program, you'll find the studies differ widely, both in what benefits and costs they include and often in what point of view they're taking. So one thing that's worth doing when you sit down to look at a valuation study and start thinking, is this the kind of study that should apply to my situation? A basic question is, what valuation perspective is being analyzed? So are we taking a utility cost perspective? Are we taking a total resource cost perspective? What perspective is this study taking? And what components are appropriate to include given that perspective? So in the paper and also in the Designing Distributed Generation Tariffs Well paper, we do talk about what benefits and costs are typically included in the different types of tests that we've just been talking about previously. And then secondly, what advocacy point of view is being presented, and how does that advocacy point of view affect which components are included? So, for example, utilities vary in how they present the evaluation of these resources. But one common utility advocacy point of view is that short-run avoided costs is the benefit of the DG system, and all of the associated distribution costs, and somehow you have to quantify those, the cost or the benefit to the grid should be included. So the net benefit of the system is often presented as the difference between these avoided short-run costs and these grid use costs. And one typical solution that's proposed that is, for implementing this view is a high fixed charge, a high monthly fixed charge for service. A DG advocate coming into a proceeding or presenting a viewpoint on valuation is often going to use a much wider range of benefits. Some of the typical ones are listed here. There's a more comprehensive list in the studies, but basically, from a DG advocacy point of view, often the benefits presented far exceed the retail rate, and so there's a real difference, and it's important to take stock of that in evaluating these. As we look, the Rocky Mountain Institute really did a service by looking at a wide range of studies last year. They really break down for each of these studies what is the question the study is attempting to answer, what are the benefits that they include, what are the costs that they include, and what this graphic shows here is the net value of distributed generation presented by these different studies. And you can see that it ranges from a low of around 4 cents a kilowatt hour to a high of nearly 30 cents a kilowatt hour. While the study does not, or the survey does not really take a position on what the right answer is, it just simply lays out there, this is how different people have taken on this question, and these are the results that they came up with taking on that approach. So I really recommend taking a look at that. If you look at the average of these studies that were surveyed, it comes out to about 16 cents, but of course the averages doesn't really represent anything because there's such a range of methodologies presented. It's really an apples and oranges average, but anyway, nonetheless, it's interesting. So a couple of pieces of work that currently exist that I recommend taking a look at if you want to dig in to the sources of valuation and also how people have measured those different sources of benefit or cost are these three that are mentioned here. There's also a couple more that I didn't mention. Of course, the California Standard Practice Manual has been in place for decades and uses many of the same sources of benefit and cost in formulating its tests. So that's another resource you could take a look at. Also, EPRI's look at customer-side resources, which they just announced what their Phase 2 scope was going to be just a few days ago. That Phase 2 scope is going to look at benefits and costs of customer-side resources. So there'll be some more resources coming out on this issue, but for now, these three resources, I think, really do a good job of defining what the terms mean and describing how they get put together into different tests, and also explaining, how different people have chosen to quantify those different constituent parts. So it's a great resource. So the other big, so the valuation approach, so as the commission considers, how do I look at these different, what the benefits are of these different policies? That valuation approach is the first step towards being able to assess net benefits of a program. A second, an associated step is rate design. What kind of rate design should I line up that it would be consistent with my valuation approach and would constitute a fair deal, both for the adopter of the PV, for the customers that do not choose to adopt, and for the utility. So, basic typical rate structure is you have a fixed charge of some amount and you have a volumetric charge, a charge that's assessed per kilowatt hour consumed. And sometimes that volumetric charge changes by time of day or by season. Sometimes it's constant all hours of the year. as far as distributed generation approaches, almost all net metered systems today all PV systems today are net metered. Net metered is a simple approach. It's easy to understand, and so it's very common today. And lining up the rate design that one chooses with a net metering approach, if that's what you choose, is an important decision. Okay, I'm having trouble advancing to the next slide. I'm clicking on the next slide and it's not advancing.
Okay, Carl, I can do it for you if you just want to let me know next slide. So is this the slide?
Okay. Yeah, that's it. Great. Thank you. So again, why is it dominant today? It's a combination of simplicity, of the purple legacy, of various state PUC rules and orders over the years. And for the PV adopting customer, it's useful. It's a simple thing to implement. Next slide. Okay, I got it. The typical issues that arise under a net metering tariff, the PV customer derives value from the grid connection, and the utility derives value from the PV generation connection. It's not always been, when the net metering started out, didn't form a significant proportion of generation resources. So there wasn't a lot of attention paid to this two-way value relationship, but now with increasing penetrations and increased use of net metering tariffs, this, coming to terms with how is the value flowing both ways is an important issue. And Joyce already described, the basic problems, so I won't repeat those points here. So there are potential cross-subsidy issues that can arise, but it is important to note that cross-subsidies can run both ways. And as shown in that picture previously, where you look at a common utility advocacy point of view versus a common solar DG advocacy point of view, you could expect that people have very different opinions on which way the cross-subsidy is running. Some say that the value of PV is less than the volumetric charges, and that has leads to under recovery of utility fixed costs, upward pressures on rates, and has consequences for non-adopting customers as well. If the value of PV is greater than those volumetric charges, then actually the PV customers are providing more value to other customers in the system, perhaps, than they're being paid. So so it can run either way. The debate today mostly, or the discussion today mostly, talks about the first of these two, but the second of the two is possible. Are they a significant problem? And don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but rate design is a crude science. You never get things exactly right running both ways, and so we certainly want to fairly compensate the utility for grid services and fairly compensate the DG producer for their services. But it's not really an exact science, and it's important to recognize that when one enters into this. Another thing that we're seeing in this discussion is a lot of discussion about the places where it's really become a severe issue, places where you have very high PV adoption, and that causing a very severe cross-subsidy issue. And to be sure, there are circumstances of that, but it's important that we recognize that not all situations are the same. This little slide taken from Energy Environmental Economics presentation from 2013 just shows different rate structures for different utilities. And you can see that the utility, the San Diego Gas and Electric, the high green time of use structure, is really different than many other utilities. And so that should be taken into account in interpreting results from that area, from that region. Secondly, this slide, I don't have time to go through this in detail, but basically the diamonds represent the levelized cost of energy and of getting power from a DG source, and the bars represent the retail rate structure. So you can see that in San Diego Gas and Electric case, the retail rate is significantly above the levelized cost of energy, the cost of producing power from that DG system. Whereas in some of these other places like Portland General and Excel, the levelized cost of energy is significantly above the retail rate. So, so the lesson here is just simply, when you enter into this investigation of whether there are subsidies, which way the subsidies are running, it's very important to take stock of where your situation actually is. There are many different ways of changing a tariff to make it reflect fair value for customers and for utilities. I don't have time to go through these in detail, but again, take a look at the reports that we mentioned. An important point to make with rate design is that there isn't one answer to this question. What this table shows, and again, I don't really have time to walk you through the nuts and bolts of it, but basically there's a current tariff shown and then three options, one that has a high fixed monthly charge, one that has a demand charge, and one that considers a bidirectional distribution charge, where basically where customers pay the system for their use of the system, and the system pays customers for the resources provided from that customer. These four cases, you can see the bottom line is the same revenue in a month. So, so you can use any one of these three methods and additional combinations that aren't represented here to come up with a revenue target. And so choosing a rate design goes beyond just reaching a revenue target. It goes to the questions of other issues associated with implementing a tariff. I don't think I really have time to walk through this issue, so I've taken a little bit more time than I should on the previous ones. But basically, happy to walk through this in question and answer time, but I don't want to go leave us without question and answer time. So I'm going to just breeze through this one. But again, this just shows the impacts of implementing these different approaches in terms of how customers are, what they pay and how they are paid. One issue that comes up is that the low-income customers and lower-use customers can be affected by high fixed charges in a disproportionate way. And this little example walks you through how that could happen. So we conclude, this comes from the Designing Distributed Generation Tariffs Well report, but we conclude with some guiding principles for designing PV tariffs. We've talked about most of these things. Utilities should be paid fairly for the services they provide. PV customers should be paid fairly for the services they provide. Rate design should be no more complicated than necessary. Rate design is kind of a separate issue from designing incentives or lost revenues, which you might address through decoupling. Those are important regulatory issues, but they're kind of separate from the rate design step. And also, it's important to remember low-income customers in this process. So kind of questions that regulators should be asking about valuation. and rate design, it's relevant to think about what level of PV adoption you have now and what level of PV adoption you expect. These, issues of being very careful about designing these tariffs and so forth, of course, become much more important when you get to very high levels of adoption and penetration. What investment will be required in our system with and without higher PV adoption? Are our utilities positioned to measure and capture locational benefits? Where PV is located matters a great deal to the benefits that it provides to the system. So are our utilities ready to point systems towards sites that are more beneficial than others? When we do an evaluation, what perspectives are we evaluating, and what sources of cost and benefit should we be including? Rate design questions include ones like these. What's the direction of the subsidy? Before assuming there is a subsidy, just because it happens to exist in a direction in some places, let's take some time and think about what is that subsidy under our current tariff. What's the direction for community solar and solar garden designs? Are there benefits for us in encouraging that? Should the residential tariff rate change, and should the DG tariff structure change because of higher adoption of PV? It's also important to differentiate. We've talked a lot about residential rate design, but non-residential rate design is really a different issue. Non-residential customers usually have a demand charge. There may not be the same cross-subsidy issues that arise with non-residential customers. So looking at the subsidy question from non-residential adopter point of view is a separate exercise and shouldn't be conflated with the residential investigation. So anyway, with that, I'll turn it back to Joyce.
Oh, actually, I think I'll pick it up because there were a couple questions for you, Carl. Well, one, we've gotten a question about will the slides be available? And the answer to that is yes. We will be posting that in the recording on the web, and I think we can send out an email to participants saying where that will be. And so, Carl, you actually had a clarifying question about the acronyms that were used on slide 27, the tests.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So PCT is the participant cost test. RIM is the ratepayer impact measure. UCT is the utility cost test. EACT is the program administrator cost test. ERC is the total resources cost test, and SCT is the societal cost test.
Okay, thanks for that. And then there's the question here, and please, folks, type in other questions if you'd like them answered. What are implications for building in incentives for plug-in electric vehicles? Do you want to take that one, Carl, or I don't know, Joyce, do you want to weigh in?
What are the implications
for incentivizing plug-in electric vehicles?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure which part of the discussion, but relative to, obviously a plug-in vehicle adds a load to the system to the extent that there are DG resources, either where the plug-in vehicles are or in the same part of the system where they are, then that could be of major benefit. So, increased penetration of electric vehicles and incentives for electric vehicles, support higher levels of cost beneficial or beneficial PV adoption, if that's what the question is asking.
Carl, there's another one here for you, and it's about the bar chart, I think on slide 44. It says, could you describe the bar chart with retail rates versus the LCOE and who wins and who loses in each case?
Okay. So let's just take two examples. Let's start with the Portland General example. So the levelized cost of energy for PGE, Portland General, in their service territory, according to E3. So, you know, of course, different people are going to calculate somewhat different numbers, but it is in the neighborhood of 25 to 30 cents is the levelized cost of producing electricity from a distributed system. If you're on a net metering tariff, you're getting paid. Let's say that you're producing on the top tier, you're getting paid according to the top tier. Then what you're getting paid for your net metering tariff, in effect, is 14 cents. So as a PV adopter, you're actually getting paid less than what it's cost you for your system. As far as as far as winners and losers, it goes to the subsidy issue of what is that energy worth to the other customers, and what's it worth to the system. So this slide doesn't really help you to understand that question. It just helps you to understand from a PV customer's perspective, how much are they getting paid relative to how much it's costing them to have a system. In the SDG&E case, the levelized cost of energy is substantially less than the retail rate. So they're getting paid a good deal more than what that system costs for them to build.
There's one more here. How do you see customer-owned distributed storage potentially impacting value measurements and rate design? Do you want to take a stab at that one, Carl?
So the value of storage, so if we go back to the benefits, let's see. Sorry, it'll take me a second here. Oh, here we go. Major categories of value. So if you go back to these categories of value, and you're asking the question, I guess the question is, what's the value of storage, and how does, again, I'm not totally clear on the question, but the value.
I can repeat it. How do you see customer-owned distributed storage potentially impacting value measurements and rate design?
So I guess they mean the value of a PV system.
I think they might be referring to the value of solar tariffs. So how would the addition of storage to a DG system impact the valuation, the value that system?
Okay. Right. Okay. So yeah. So I mean, obviously the addition of storage makes PV more, in combination with the storage, a more flexible resource. So it can be used when it's needed most, which means that the need for investment in other resources to ensure reliable service would be less. So your integration cost is going to be lower if you have a PV system with storage, and the benefits of the PV system with storage to the system, such as deferral of capacity and deferral of transmission and distribution capacity, would most likely be greater.
And if I can just add one thing to that, I think the same is true not only with storage, but also with other technologies such as certain controllers that allow for the DG system to provide power in the case that the grid is down. There's folks that are looking into the value that those kind of smart grid technologies and controlling technologies and smart inverters have, what kind of benefits they contribute and how it impacts the value of solar to the whole system.
Okay. Did you have anything else, Carl, you wanted to say? That was the last question that we have, and we are at 2 o'clock, so I think it's time to go. Unless do you have any last remarks you want to make, Carl, or?
No. Just feel free to contact me if you'd like to talk about any of this more.
Okay. Nope. Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much to everyone who participated. We really appreciate it. And as I said, we'll be sending a note that has the information where the presentation will be available, and we'll make sure that you have the information on the 2 studies that were discussed in this session as well. So I appreciate your participation. Have a great day. Thank you.